Welcome back, ladies and gents, to Recasting Culture. Today, I have with me somewhat of a professional speaker. This is, someone that I've seen at Steubenville conferences speak on like YouTube. I've always wanted to go to a Steubenville conference, but this is one of those ones that I've seen speak conferences. One of my friends actually attended his talk live and highly recommended it. And so when I thought I could reach out to someone who wants to talk about hope, this was the first name on my list. And so I actually have with me David Calavitta. I'm going to get David to introduce himself, and then we're going to jump straight in.
Sure, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, my name is David. I spent a lot of time in ministry for the church, both in parish and then more in a national apostolate level. And then I get to travel and share the gospel, and I really enjoy that. And my day job, I run a small creative agency with one of my good friends. And yeah, I'm married, got two little kids, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they are wild and energetic and exhausting and everything two little boys should be. Um, Live out here in Southern California, born and raised out here. Spent a few different places up in Portland and Georgia, but California, as dysfunctional as it is, California's home, and so we're just trying to be a family for Jesus out here in California, and it's not bad weather either, so we're doing okay.
I was going to say the pros and cons kind of weigh each other out. The weather is beautiful. It may not be the most functional place in society, but it
Yeah,
kind of balances itself out.
yeah.
Well, David, thank you again for coming on. Really, I'm very excited. But recently had an episode with a friend of mine, and he talked about the importance of stories, and that really made me
Mm,
focus on, we should hear the stories of the people that are coming on. Like, why are they here?
yeah,
Why are they the way they are? Why do they care so much about what they're speaking about? So I wonder if you could, somewhat tell us, like, how did you come to your faith? Was this something you
yeah,
always had? Like, kind of just walk us through it.
for sure. I mean, I definitely was raised in I would say maybe like a routinely faithful Catholic family, and I say routinely in that it was a part of our life. It wasn't like, hey, every night we're praying as a family kind of thing, but it also wasn't like a Christmas and Easter kind of thing. We were there Sunday faithfully. I will say my mom probably lived that out a little bit more intentionally. And as a kid, just kind of remember seeing her just having like a devoted prayer life and things like that. And my dad had those moments as well, not to disparage him at all. It just, I think they just had different sort of spiritual practices. And obviously a dad being a dad, sometimes as men, we can be a little bit more closed off or maybe even more quiet about things we're struggling with or something. And faith, obviously, with doubts and big questions and will God be there? Will he provide? I'm sure maybe some of that could have, for my dad, been like perceived as a sign of weakness in his mind, and so maybe that's why he wasn't so forward with it, whereas my mom was very forward with it. But nonetheless, raised in a Catholic family, and it 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 was just that. It was going to my parents' church, if that makes sense, for most of my life. And then when I got into high school, where I grew up in California was, it ended up being a pretty dangerous place. A lot of gangs, a lot of drugs. And when I got into high school, both my parents were school teachers at the elementary level. And they said, there's no way you're going to we had one public high school in our town. So there's no way you're going there because just all the problems. And so they sent me to the only private school in the area, which happened to be a Protestant or evangelical high school run by, I think the denomination was First Assemblies of God.
Mhm.
And so I went there, and I was uh, I was one of two Catholics in this Christian high school, and one, I was so grateful for my experience there because the Protestants and the evangelicals, they have such a good zeal for the gospel. They are so impactful, and they prioritize preaching the gospel in a compelling way. And so it was really there that like the idea of faith became this very personal invitation of not just going to church because it's something we should do, but having this need for a savior and encountering Jesus in that need. And so I'm grateful for that Protestant school and that background, and so that really kind of opened my heart to faith. And we were still going to Catholic church every Sunday. Um, but then as I started to kind of dive into it more, our Catholic church, where a new church had opened up near us, and they had an amazing youth ministry program called Life Team. The youth ministry there was just awesome. And at that point, I wasn't opposed to Jesus. I loved Jesus very much. But I thought Catholics were kind of weird, and I knew I was one, but like I
Yeah.
wasn't like embracing it.
Yeah.
And then this youth minister, like he would see me after mass and he would just constantly invite me to come and I kind of brushed him off politely the best I could. And through his persistence and just some friends that were going, I ended up, kind of going to this life team program. And there it was really cool. It started this whole like, kind of this tension, right? Because I was going to the evangelical school and even the churches on like a Wednesday. And I was out of good intention, the youth pastor there I believe he loved me dearly. I
Hmm.
believe he meant well by me, but he also had a lot of misconceptions about Catholicism. And so, like one day he was like, "Oh man, David, like, I love that you're here. I'm just worried though, because, you're going to hell." And I'm like, you know what I mean? Like, I am? Like, what do you
Yeah,
mean? Like,
wild.
what do you know about my life? I'm trying, right?
Yeah,
And he's like, "Well, no, like you're Catholic." You know what I mean? And I was like, "Oh man," like I didn't, and so kind of started raising this question, this tension, because in my mind, I love Jesus and I just wanted to be where he was and I wanted to follow him. But then also my mom is one of the most devout people I've ever encountered. And how could she be going to hell? Like the
yeah, right.
math wasn't mathing up. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? And, so then it started this kind of question of like really understanding like the unique aspects of Catholicism and what the teachings are. And it was crazy the way God used it. I would go to like the Wednesday youth group at the Protestant church and they would my youth pastor would bring up this, like, "Oh, like you worship Mary." And I'm like, "Oh man, like I'm a worse Catholic than I thought because I didn't even
yeah,
know I worshiped Mary."
that's
You know
right.
what I mean? Like right in my head, I'm like, I don't know what
Yeah.
I'm doing as a Catholic, I guess. And then literally that next weekend at Life Team, the topic of the youth night would be like Mary and the intercession of the saints.
Mm,
And then like he would kind of bring up this accusation like, "Oh, well, you believe the Pope is Jesus, this, that, and the other." And I'm like, I didn't know, like I
yeah.
really don't know what we believe about that. And then the next weekend, like Peter and the papacy. And then finally it was like, "Well, you believe in this like Jesus cookie." In the 90s, out here in California, there was this thing called a Chicks publication. And again, a well-meaning entity, but it was a very evangelical production company. They produced these little Chick tracks, like little booklets. The guy's name was Chick, and they produced these little like booklets that were comic books, and basically they were all about. I don't know why hearts are going off. I'm sorry
No
there.
idea.
Um, uh, but they were all about like really just bashing Catholicism from like a horrible misunderstanding. And the big thing was like, "Oh, you believe in the Jesus cookie." And so this youth pastor was like, "Well, you believe," like, he kind of pulled that card. And I was like, I don't, like I know we go to communion. I guess I don't even know what communion is.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I was at lunch actually, and we're talking about this. And the other Catholic in the school sitting at the table with me, he was actually a very good Catholic.
Oh,
And
great. There we go.
right, my Protestant friends were like, "Oh, well, you believe that that communion's really Jesus." And I was dumb. I go, "No, we don't. That's stupid." And then my friend who's the real Catholic, and he's this quiet, well, and he kind of
Yeah.
just hits my arm. He goes, "You idiot." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "We do believe that." And I'm like, "We do?" Right. And then all of a sudden, like I go to Life Teen and Life Teen's talking about the Eucharist and giving apologetics for it. And ultimately, to bring a long story, slightly less
Yeah.
longer, um, in high school, I ended up going on this retreat and had just an amazing encounter with Christ in the Eucharist during adoration. And for me, that was that sort of like that tipping point. And it wasn't that like, oh, evangelical or Protestant is bad. It was more of like levels of fullness. You know what I mean? Like if you
Hmm.
have your
Sure.
cup and there's a lot of good, and I'm so grateful for what I got to experience as a Catholic among evangelicals in high school. But then kind of seeing that go further in that the idea of the sacraments and the Eucharist and have that encounter with Jesus, it was such an encounter that like I may not be able to explain it or have the right theology around it, but I knew it was him. And so I just had to follow that and dive into that. And so that really was what kind of anchored my faith in the church when I was in high school. And ever since then, I've just kind of, God has been so good at just, I think, keeping me on a short leash. I think that's why I've been involved in ministry so long. He's like, I need you close to me because you'll wander. And I think the
Hmm.
greatest way he can keep me close to him is by keeping me tied into ministry efforts and things like that. And so, it's been a great grace and mercy on his end to keep me involved.
Yeah.
But I think that's, for my own salvation more so than anyone else's,
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and listening to your story, I think it's quite fascinating because I'm trying to think of like I work in a school now, and I'm just thinking of the culture at this Baptist church. I'm curious. There's two Catholics, which is a wild situation. That's not something I've ever encountered in my life. yeah, what I'm trying to compare the cultures. Would you say that the culture today of like, high schoolers today, where it's more like apathetic to their faith, I guess is kind of the more typical route compared to there. I would guess that a lot of people cared about their faith, and I guess that's at least a good
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, no, it absolutely was. Like, I mean, I think generally speaking, a lot of the teens are there because they're forced by their parents to go to this Christian school, right? There's a great deal of that. But I will say, like, growing up in Southern California in the 90s, like, there was this real concentrated, for lack of better words, like this Jesus movement of like,
Hmm.
we had a lot of evangelical churches kind of birthed out in California from the 70s on up. And so in the 90s especially, like, there was I think a good deal of Christian culture in Southern California. A lot of like Christian bands and music and things like that, it kind of came from out here. There was a lot of different kind of like mega, churches that you
Hmm.
would have out here. And so I would say generally in the Protestant world, there was and even like, I think it's something that as Catholics, um, can maybe aspire to in a lot of ways, but there was a great zeal, among their Christianity. Most of it, at least compared to maybe my experience of Catholicism in the 90s, was, it was intentional and not just purely obligation. I'm sure some of that was there, but being that it was so intentional, it was a conviction. A lot of those teens, I mean, like, teens are teens and we're all stupid and we all stray,
That's right.
but even there though, there was I think a good, um, Christian culture at that school among the teens. Just maybe they were raised in a zealous family, or they had really their own personal conversions already or along that journey. And so there was an openness. I think if it wasn't um, the positive peer pressure, maybe, or the not even that they pressured me in that sense, but like it was more of the water that we were swimming in, maybe
That's
if
right.
that makes sense. And so it was much easier for me to be a little bit more open and
Hmm.
receptive. And I mean, even like, have conversations with teachers and stuff that I remember, like, for example, like my history teacher, right? History. And yet he was one of the coolest people to talk to about Jesus,
Oh, yeah.
and so I just think that the openness to the culture, I benefited from that greatly because at that point, most anything fighting against Jesus in my life was just my own stubbornness,
Right, right.
It wasn't necessarily the immediate world around me, at least in
Hmm.
high school, at the school itself.
Yeah, and I have a friend of mine who she grew up going to, I think it's Camp Ozark, and I think it's a non it's a ecumenical
Yeah.
camp, and she grew up Catholic and very Catholic. But as she was going, she was like, "But these people are like really you're right. The zealous is exactly the same. What they're so attractive, they're so on fire for
Yeah.
this." And like I go back to my parish, and it's just not that. And she was really struggling with it. And for her, it was a similar event. She went to NCYC, and like she
Okay,
really
yeah.
had a moment there, and like she really took it. No, I'm taking my Catholic faith seriously, and that
Yeah.
really changed her. And now she's a Catholic high school theology teacher, and like
Yeah.
she's really. But there is something so attractive. And I think you're right about the water. This is the water that you're swimming in. Is like
Yeah.
when you're surrounded by people who believe something so passionately, there's only so long that like you can hold out before that starts seeping in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there, are you familiar with Dr. Peter Kreeft? So a Catholic philosopher, theologian, just amazing. The dude's probably written like 80 books or something.
Yeah, I'm
Just
sure.
one of my favorite authors. But he has this talk. I think he's written into one of his books. I can't place it off the top of my head, but this particular talk that I was listening to, and basically he calls himself an evangelical Catholic, and what he's meaning by that is like that sometimes we're like, oh, there's evangelicals and Catholics, and sure, like theologically, right? There's differences in what's going on, but he's affirming exactly what you're saying. He's like, there are so many things that the evangelicals do so well, and how they prioritize like their daily devotional life, right? Like their the quiet time, as they may call it, right? And they prioritize scripture and they prioritize like the zeal for evangelization. And then there are things that we have as Catholics that like they don't, but are so helpful, right? Like sacramental life, right?
Hmm.
Tradition, the magisterium. And he's like, we need to be evangelical Catholics in that if we're filled with the Holy Spirit and we're living out a Catholic life, we should not be able to help but to evangelize, but to be in love with Jesus, but to love his word and find nourishment in it and speak about it. And so I think there's something very profound. And I realize that may rub some Catholics the wrong way, to hear the phrase evangelical Catholic, but I think if you just step back and break down like evangelical just meaning like someone who is evangelizing, who is speaking of how God
That's
has
right.
changed my life. It's like the woman at the well, right?
Yeah.
When Jesus encounters her heart and she's just running home and she's like, I've got to tell you about this man who knew everything about me, right? She's evangelizing, not because she is doing it for confirmation service credit or something like that, but her life was changed and she can't help but to think about it and to talk
Yeah.
about it and to
Yeah.
share about it. I think it's kind of like, I don't know if you're in Chicago area, right?
Yeah. In that area. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I've never been out there. Well, I mean, I've been through it, but like I'm imagining there's probably some killer restaurants in Chicago. We have killer restaurants out here, and I'm sure you have like a restaurant that when it pops up and like you go for the first time, you're like, this place is so good, and you tell your friend
Sure.
about it, or you're like,
Yeah.
hey, dude,
Absolutely.
couple of weeks, let's go. We do it for restaurants, we do it for movies. It's a natural human thing, but sometimes as Catholics, we're like, oh no, that's the Protestant way that they handle
Hmm.
their faith. We just kind of sit quietly in our pew about it, and I think that's what Peter Kreeft is kind of getting out of like needing to be this evangelical Catholic to have the fullness of truth, but to love it and live it and speak about it with the passion that we would see with the evangelical or Protestants.
Yeah, and I grew up in a charismatic ministry, and so
Mm,
especially my mother, I think, especially as an example
yeah,
of this, like, is someone who is so passionate about this that like it kind of seeps from her. In some sense, it's kind of annoying because you're like, please, like, keep it in some
yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But what I do give them, and I really do, like, they see someone who's sick, and they're like, oh, let's go pray for them. They see
Right,
someone who's like in pain, and like, let's go pray. And I'm like, that's as someone who is maybe not as charismatic as most people, I'm like, that's really hard. But I'm like, but if I believe this is true, that's probably what I should be doing.
100%,
Yeah, I don't
exactly.
know.
And to that point, that was one thing when I was going to this evangelical high school, like their openness to the Holy Spirit and their belief in the Holy Spirit living and being active and present and still like bringing the gifts and the charisms and the fruits and believing in miracles, like was such a inspiring and attractive thing, but also like at that point it was almost a terrifying thing, and not in a bad way, but right, anytime you're encountering sort of like you're coming to the edge of mystery, if I could explain it better than that, like it's equal parts like exciting and terrifying, right? It's almost like I don't know, being out in the ocean or like within a big wave or something, or like a crazy storm, right? It's thrilling, but it's also terrifying because you realize there's a power here, there's something bigger than me outside of me and I don't control it, kind of thing. And I mean, even having those moments of encountering like the way they would worship, the way that I mean they would pray with people, and even just like the gift of prophecy or speaking in tongues, and encountering this like as a high schooler, like the first time, because again as a Catholic, I didn't I didn't have a context for it, and I want to be very
That's right.
clear about that. It's not that Catholicism doesn't have a context for it. It's that my experience of Catholicism up to that point was such a one-dimensional, routine, shallow, maintenance, mediocrity mode of Catholicism. You know what I mean? But like the idea of a charismatic life, the fruits, the gifts, the charisms, like that is scriptural. It's traditional. It's our church fathers talk about it. It's in our teachings and not maybe in our day-to-day practice. And that's why it feels so foreign, and maybe in a way that allows us to be like, oh, that's not for us. It's for
Hmm.
them. But to your point, you see it and you're like, oh man, if I believed it though, belief should lead to an action. I should be willing to.
That's right. Well, and that's what all the saints did, right? All the saints didn't
Right,
go around going, "I'll just stick to my books and my prayers, and we'll
right,
call it a day."
right,
Like
right.
we look at this, we look at Jace Cupertino or like Francis of
Hmm.
Assisi, and you're like, they did these great things, and you're like, well, they did it because they tried. It's not like no one they ever just sat there and it just happened to them. That very
Of
rarely happens.
course. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think it's a great point, even with like St. Francis, like, right. I mean, you read into his life, like, obviously, like he made some radical life decisions, right? The turning from the riches and the whole thing. But he also, like, in addition to that, like lived a spiritually radical life, right? And not just in his devotion, but in his action, his practice. Like, I mean, like the way he would speak and pray and pray for people for healing and for all these different things. And yet I think it's much because it's comfortable, we sort of reduced Francis down to the garden statue. Do you know what
That's
I mean?
right.
Well,
That's
he
right.
was just the guy who was like, don't get too greedy and
Hmm.
pet some birds. You know what I mean? But really, he
That's
was
right.
like out there living this like he lived a miraculous life. And that's but that part of Francis it is hard to talk
It's
about a lot
terrifying.
because it puts you face to face with like, well, aren't we supposed to be like St. Francis? And
Yeah.
not just like walking around like peace, peace, which is
That's
good,
right.
but it's like
Yeah.
peace, peace. Oh, I'm casting out demons. Peace, peace.
Yeah. That's
I'm praying for the
right.
sick. You know what I mean? Like
That's right.
that's a
Yeah.
whole different end of the spectrum.
And there's that quote that's typically attributed to him. I was just recently talking about it. It was like, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. And I'm like, has anyone read Francis' story? This man
Right.
is like the most like outspoken human being that you could meet.
See, you know what? I think it's fascinating you bring it up because like, right. First of all, that quote, like when you dig into it, I have a good friend of mine, Joel Stepanek. He's
Sure.
yeah, he's just an awesome dude. But one of his like, just sort of like personal interests is he just likes to dive in and source quotes, like find out like where did this come from, what was the context, how much has it been mangled over the years or whatever. And that, I mean, he's not the only one. I remember hearing Scott Hahn talk about like that quote. Francis never said it, right? But we've misattributed to him. Excuse me, I apologize. We misattributed to him probably because it gives us an excuse to not have to live the way you're talking about. Do you know what I mean? We're like, I just, preach the gospel, use words when necessary. And you're like, first of all, like, if you believe that, have you ever come across a point where you've said it's necessary? Because probably not.
No,
Right?
that's right. That's fair
Like,
enough.
you've
Yeah.
made an excuse out of
Yeah.
everything. Oh, well, I'm just going to wash my car and my neighbor will know that I love Jesus. And you're like,
That's right.
well, come on, but it's just so easy to disregard that and say like, basically mind your business and the people who are dying to see Jesus, they'll come to see Jesus if you mind your business. It's like, no, like, yeah, live to where like your life is the Bible someone can encounter, but like they've got to hear it. They've got to know it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I guess, I'm thinking about like your ministry and like your website's name is Hold Fast Hope,
yeah.
right? I guess the next kind of thing I want to talk about is like why the focus on hope so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was like, hope's been an interesting thing, I think, just in life and really like the more, I guess if I could step back and
Absolutely.
be very transparent, right. Like as a young, like kind of youth minister and just being involved in ministry, right. You kind of have this, normal or like fixed relationship with the right faith, hope, and love, right? Those virtues. And right, the church teaches on this, right? That those are the virtues that you're given by the power of God. You're given that in your baptism, and we always pray, like even like when we're praying the rosary, usually those like couple of beads after the Our
That's right.
Father after the creed is, like, Lord, increase my faith, hope, and love. So there was just a normal, I guess, relation with that. But there was a band that I grew up with called Thrice. They were this like, again, 90s music in California, Christian music in the 90s. Like, well, it was a scene, man. It was a vibe for sure. And this band called Thrice was this sort of like a hardcore punk band, and I loved them, and I still do. But one of the lyrics, it was that phrase, hold fast hope. And the whole song is basically about like this, like being in the ship and the storm is like tossing the ship around and like grabbing the ropes, you know what I mean? Because that's where the phrase hold fast comes from. St. Paul talks about that. I mean, he uses that phrase hold fast in scripture, but really that's what it means. Like, it's like that idea of like, when the wind is blowing the sails and you have to bring the sails against the wind so you can survive, like holding fast is to like grab a hold of that rope, and like to hold fast is just to basically grip on and not let go. And so this song is kind of presenting this picture of just like storms and doubts and questions. And the phrase is just like hold fast hope, like in the midst of that, like grab on and just like hold to hope even when it doesn't make sense. And for me, part of that, that tension, even like I was saying about like evangelical and Catholicism in my own heart and trying to understand like teachings and all of that. And then even moving on to like this area of my life of like discernment. And I kind of carried a heavy dose of scrupulosity, especially in that life. And so discernment was like a painful situation. And I was at certain points convinced that like that like serving God meant finding the thing you least want to do in life and doing that, as
Yeah.
if like, you know, like, because right, Jesus is like, take up your cross and follow me. And in my mind, I'm like, well, like the cross is horrible. Jesus would never want the cross.
Yeah.
So if he did it, then my math is sort of like, well, I've got to,
Yeah.
in order to follow him, I've got to find the thing that brings me the least idea of fulfillment, the least idea of happiness, the worst idea of life I can think of, and that must be what I have to do because
Right.
it's my cross. And that's a very messy, poor way to approach discernment or vocational stuff, and or even just your relationship with God in general. But during that time, there was a lot of just, I think, inner turmoil, and I felt like, depending on the day, like it was like I loved Jesus and I believed in him, but like I had such great doubt of like, just, is he good? Or is he good
Yeah.
for me? Like, is he happy with me? Does, you know what I mean? Or like, even for like his will for my life, is my life, like his plan for my life, like a treasure hunt that he forgot we were playing? Do you know what I mean? Like, and I'm screwed. I'm up to my own to find it. And so
Yeah.
that song and that sentiment really resonated, because like there were a lot of times looking back, it feels like they were very small things, but going
Mm-hmm.
through it, there were moments where it was like, in my own limited experience and my, you know, even poorer faith, was, it felt like at that time, like a dark night of the soul. Do you know what I mean? And
Right.
I know, you know, not to maybe to some degree for me at that point in my faith, it was some desolation. I know it's not like, I'm not comparing it to like John of the Cross or something like
That's
that,
right.
but you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
as a young believer, and so just that sense of like holding to hope, even though I didn't really have a clear idea of what hope really meant, just more of a sentiment of hope, it just became important to me. So that phrase, hold fast hope, sorry, was just something that like stuck with me a lot. And then that ended up just being like a big part of my own, I think, prayer life, like just wanting to have hope against my own sin, against my own struggles, my own disbeliefs, my own doubts, my own fears of if God is involved in this thing or not, you know? And so that phrase kind of came out of that, or was just something I held to out of that. But the more like I've grown, hopefully spiritually, but definitely in physically, definitely in age, just seeing more life and kind of like entering the idea of hope with maybe a more rational, like discerned approach. Hope has become like just such a, on a personal level, like such a real virtue, right? Because I think sometimes like hope is sort of like, I hope it gets better, right? Or
Yeah.
it's like wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe to some degree there can be a surface level of that, like, well, I hope tomorrow gets better or something, right? But at its more and more, like at its core, what I'm coming to from my own experience, like realize is that like hope, it's not a sentiment, right? It's not a sign at Hobby Lobby, right? It's not just like a good feeling. It's not
Right.
like the smell of a candle. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like hope is actually like an action. It's to live in hope, right? Pope Benedict says, um, he who has hope lives differently,
Hmm.
right? And I don't think we've treated, at least my understanding of hope, in with that ramification, or
No.
consequence, we'll say. Because in my mind, it's like when you have hope, it's sort of just like this ambiguous wanting of something better. And Benedict's saying, if you have hope, it actually causes you to live in a different way, right? There's a change in how you live. So like, you without hope are making certain decisions, but you with hope are making different decisions, and they're
Mm.
tangible, they're actions. And so for me, and I don't know if this is fully, I guess, don't scrutinize this from like a like a theological depth of Aquinas, but I think there's something here in some of like my own reading and studying. But like hope is really an act of faith, right? We often say like, yeah, well, you have faith, like take a leap of faith. I think what we mean there is like, if you believe, then you will take an action based upon that belief, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think really that's more what hope is. It's, I proclaim that Jesus, let's just say, for example, I proclaim that he will provide for my family. That is a belief I hold.
Mm-hmm.
But if I choose my career and how I spend my money and how I orchestrate my life so that way I never have to depend upon his providence, then I'm probably not living from that faith, and I'm probably not living hopeful. I'm living more fearful. Say, do you know Father Jacques Philippe? Have you heard of him? Okay, so one of my again, Peter Grief, Jacques Philippe, awesome. Different writers, but what I love about
Yeah,
Jacques
yeah,
Philippe is just like small little books. I like little
yeah.
books.
I think it's
And
this
his
one.
book, yeah, that's the one I was going to reference. Yeah, Searching for
This
and
one.
Maintaining Peace.
Yeah.
That's a book I keep going back to. But in there, he talks about God's providence working like a parachute. He says, and I'm going to paraphrase it, right? But he says basically a parachute works only when there's space between you and the parachute so that it has room to open. He said, he said God's providence works in that same way, but most of us orchestrate our lives so we never have to have room for God's providence to intervene or for God's providence to open. And I think that for me, that image is really what hope, when Benedict says, one who has hope lives differently, to me, that's what hope actually is. It's an action, right? And even St. Paul talking about faith being the substance of things hoped for, right? That there's this interplay, this relationship. And at the end of the day, it gets muddy because faith, hope, and love are actually like they're separate virtues, but they're all actually interconnected and related. And depending on how long you stare at one, you end up with the other. And there's sort of like this immutable relationship of them that's almost Trinitarian to some degree, right?
That's right.
But that image of hope, or for me, that image of the parachute is hope, because it's this idea of, if I believe God will provide, then I'm free to live my life in the gap. That there is a gap in which I don't know how to fill that gap. I'm not responsible for filling that gap. I'm not capable of filling that gap.
Yeah.
But I'm trusting that he is. Now, how he feels it, when he feels it, where he feels it, like that's on his providence. Right? That's you're surrendering to his lordship. But I think for me, in order to allow hope to not just be the sentiment of like, I'm hoping in a better day or whatever it is really comes down to, what do you believe about God? And then if you were to follow that, what gaps does that lead in your life?
Mm-hmm.
And that's then actually like how you live in hope, right? Chesterton says something to the effect of, exactly at the moment hope ceases to be reasonable, does it become useful? And I think that's that gap, right? Reasonable hope is well, I'll just work hard and then I'll have the money I need, right? But real hope is, I will work hard in co-laboring for Jesus, but trusting that ultimately he provides what my family needs today and tomorrow. Do you know? And so therefore I don't have to work a 72-hour work day. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
because I'm not the one filling in the gap. Right?
Right.
I'll work what God has assigned me to do. I'll do it with the best of my ability, but I have hope. So therefore, when it's time for me to turn that off, I can, because I have a savior who's saving me and I don't have to save myself. You know,
Right.
and I think you can, in my mind, at least, I'm trying to transplant that to every arena, right? Whether it's my sin, right? Because even that, like when we're in sin and we mess up, the sentiment of hope is, I hope God will forgive me. Let me clean myself up. Let me do all the things and then represent myself to him. Right? But really that's not hope in the face of sin. Hope in the face of sin is, God, I have no merits. I've messed up. I have nothing to offer you but my brokenness. That gap, I can't cross that gap. I can't save myself, but I'm going to, but you say, and I believe that you forgive the sinner, that you love unconditionally. So I'm going to step out, go to reconciliation, confess my sin, whatever it may be. I believe that's an act of hope. Yeah, balloons for reconciliation, that's fine.
That's fine.
I don't know why my camera does that, man. I apologize.
No, you're good.
But I think I'll stop kind of maybe rambling, but hopefully that paints a picture. Like hope to me is an action, right? Hope or hope demands an action. If you say you're a person of hope, that your action has to change. It's not just wishful thinking when things are bad. It definitely is living a certain way when things are bad, right? When a family member is sick, right? Hope is praying for healing. Hope is also stepping back and saying, should this end in death, the resurrection is the final
Yeah.
say,
Yeah. That's
right?
it.
And so I'm going to talk to them, my neighbor, my family, my whatever, about Jesus, and help their hearts to be right with God, because like hope isn't weighed by the
Yeah.
end of this time, right? Hope is
Exactly.
weighed by eternity, and ultimately, like if you that was what made the Christians so in the book of Acts and the early church so unbelievably powerful, is they knew they were going to die, many
Yeah.
of them at the hands of persecution, and
Mhm.
they're like, but it doesn't matter because we will live for eternity, right? It's an ultimate like, dude, hold my beer kind of moment, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's just sort of like, wait, hold on, wait. If the best the world can do is kill us and we're
We're
already going to
good.
live forever, oh,
We're fine.
right
Who
now I
cares?
can live radically, and I think
Yeah.
that's hope in that sense,
Yeah.
right? It's living differently because of what you profess to believe about God, and knowing that he'll step in to fill that gap, right? In their case, God will fill the gap between my earthly death and my resurrection. I can't do it. The parachute will open. He'll handle it. He's already proven it from the cross and his resurrection. So let's go live with hope, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm sorry,
And
it's a bit
so,
of a windy explanation, but
no,
that's my
absolutely.
thoughts at least.
No, I get it. And, when you were speaking, I think I have two examples that come to my head of this hope. And I think one of them people would listen to and go, yeah, whatever. But then the other one I think is a bit more concrete. I think the first one is when I was part of this ministry, I had a friend of mine. He wanted to be a doctor. He was studying for his exams, but he was every single weekend we had ministry. There was hardly any weekends off that we weren't going to another place to preach or to a retreat or whatever. And like he basically did not have any time to study. Like all the
Mm,
way through his high school, all the way
yeah,
through A levels. So we have standardized exams at the end of our year every single year, and that's what decides what we do. And he just never had to, like he would be at a retreat the weekend before like the Wednesday final. And like he would be doing that every single weekend, months and months in advance. And every single time he would come in and they'd be like, "Are you studying?" He's like, "I've got a retreat. And I think this is important. I think it's worth me being here for." And every single and he's now in med school and he's fine, he's gonna be a doctor. And I always remember that example of someone who's willing to go, I'm sacrificing what in some selfish ways, like what's probably not even a selfish way, in some like real personal way, this is important to me
there's
for
a
something that
calling
I
there.
think is
Yeah,
right. There's something even more important to me that I can't sacrifice. And
yeah,
I thought that was always a great example.
yeah,
And but then the second example is my mother, and my mother is both a phenomenal example and sometimes, by the world standard, definitely financially responsible. But the reason for that is she would work really hard, but the second someone would come to her saying, "Hey, we need this money to like build a church. We need this money for this person who's sick," like she would give way more than she had. Like by more than she had, she's not going to debt, but she's like taking away from the things that she would need, like necessities. And she
yeah,
would just give it away and she would go, either I'll work more, but a lot of the time
yeah,
there wouldn't be that much time to work more. And
right,
then just at the right moment, maybe someone she gave money to 5, 10 years ago would randomly appear with, "Hey, here's the money back," or like
yeah,
just these random moments. And I remember
yeah,
seeing that so many times. Like it's partly why I'm so willing to just give money away, but not
right.
as like virtuous as she is. I'm giving money away for stupid things. But like I've just lived. I've seen a life where she's so confident that Christ will provide what is lacking.
Exactly.
She would just give it away, and
Right,
it's just not a financially stable
right,
model. But
right.
she lives it so well. And I can't take that away from her, or like the trust or the hope that she has in Christ in that.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, and you kind of me and Cheyenne recently just got married a month, 2 months ago.
nice.
Oh,
Congrats.
whatever it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
we've been thinking about finances and trying things out.
yeah,
It's really hard to like budget in Christ. Like,
for
what does it
sure.
mean to like?
Right.
I don't know what that means. How do I live a hopeful life in that? And
Yeah,
looking at my mother, I'm trying to wrestle that out. I'm still trying to figure that out.
yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before I keep going.
Well, I mean, I think ultimately, and even as you're talking, just like thinking about like the lives of just teens or whatever it may be, like I think at the end of the day, like any situation that like to live hopeful, right? Like your mom, like to have such hope in God's providence that she is then free to say like, I can put this money at your feet, Lord, and this is a need you presented, so I'm free to do it. It only comes back to this singular idea is that like, is God real, and is he who he says he is? Because if he is, then I am loved and I am cared for in a way that is radically like life altering. And I think let's just say money, for example. I think it was Father Mike Schmitz, right? Small up and coming priest. You may have heard of
That's
him.
right. Never heard of him.
Yeah. Years ago, I think he was given a homily, and he was talking. He said that like in the Gospels, the singular thing that Jesus talked most about, and I can't remember if it was most aside from like sin, but I think it was just most, was this idea of money or possessions, some form of that. And he said the reason Jesus talks so much about money or possessions is because money and possessions are the the one thing we look to that is the greatest imitation or impersonation of God in our lives, right? Because we look to money as possessions. I mean, think about what we look, right? Security, safety, identity, affirmation, right? Except like all these different things. And these are things we're supposed to be finding in God, find our security, find our identity, find our purpose, find our, even our worth, right? Our power, all in God. But money becomes this quick substitution for God in our lives. And so the idea of tithing is like, yeah, like people need, like the church needs money, but like it, the greatest thing about tithing isn't that the church needs money, so you're doing a good thing if you give the money away to
No,
the
right.
church. It's literally, it's God's way of helping us to reorder our
That's right.
attachments
That's right.
and to say, God, I trust you more than I trust this money, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what idolatry is, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
what is the thing most present in my life that I'm placing my trust in, right? And is it? And most of us, myself first and foremost, have a difficult time serving God, and we create idols because we ultimately don't believe that God is who he says he is and that he will be who he says he is in the place of our life and our
That's right.
needs in what we face, you know? And so
Yeah.
therefore, if it's really, I'm going to ramble, so forgive me, but it's the garden. It's Genesis 3.
Yeah. 100%.
The lie in the garden, when you see the conversation between Satan and Eve, ultimately comes down to this. The lie is that God won't provide. Like that's it. Eve has desires for life. She didn't create these desires for life. God made them in her, right? God made desires in her, desires that need, right? That long for satisfaction. And he did that because he wanted to be the God who would satisfy. But in the garden, Satan says to her, did God say you can't eat of any of these trees? In other words, Eve, your heart's hungry, you're starving. Did God really put you in a garden that would satisfy all of the desires of your hearts and tell you to starve? And Eve comes back. She's like, no, no, no. Like he said, we can eat of all the trees, just not this one tree in the garden. And if we eat of it, if we look at it, right, we'll die. If we touch it, we'll
Yeah.
die. And then Satan says this, you will not die,
Yeah.
right? One of those is a lie. There's a tree in the garden. God says, if you eat of it, you'll die. Satan says, if you eat of it, you won't die. One of those
Right.
has to be a lie, right? And then Satan goes on to say, God knows well that if you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like him, right? In other words, you have desires in life. God is holding out on you. He can satisfy him. Here's the tree that can do it. He just doesn't want to satisfy your heart. In other
That's
words, God is not good. God cannot be trusted. In fact, the catechism, don't quote me, but I think it's paragraph 397, 394, 397, I think, says, when it talks about for the first sin, it says to the effect of mankind's first sin consisted in letting trust in our creator die in our heart.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
and it goes on to say, like, then abusing our freedom, reaching out and like whatever the follow up is, or committing the sin. And it says all sin and all subsequent sin would consist in disobedience towards God and lack of trust in his goodness. And that's ultimately, like, at the end of the day, Adam and Eve didn't sin because they were bad. They sinned because they believed God wasn't good. And if God is
Yeah.
not good,
Yeah.
and here I am with all these needs in my life, then I'm screwed because I'm left to save myself. I'm left to figure out, how do I satisfy? How do I, and whatever that is, whether it's money, health, looks,
Absolutely.
popularity, value, importance, acceptance, right? These are all the things we make idols out of that are verified needs, not needs we gave ourselves. They're needs that God created in humanity, but we don't trust that he's the God who will meet those needs. So then we turn to the idols, right? And I
That's right.
think money is it just happens to be probably the most, I would say money
Yeah.
and sex are probably the two most prevalent idols we make out of those needs, you know?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. And I was thinking, so I'm thinking about how one can foster this virtue of hope in our lives. And one of the things I remember, there was a time, I think a couple of years ago, where like I had a problem with some type of like paperwork, and like there was a situation where I had to leave the country, all these things that were happening. And I remember sitting in the chapel. I was at this adoration chapel, and I opened up the Bible. I'm not the greatest Lectio Divina person. Most of the time, I've got a 15-minute time. I'm going to pray through it. It's not going to be great, but we're going to get it done. But this
Uh-huh.
one day, I opened up the scripture. I have no idea what the passage was, but the word that really like stuck out to me was the word remember.
Mm,
And it like burned into my brain. And what really kept on happening was it was like all the times in my life where I had been lacking or I had not done something where the Lord provided. And he was like,
yeah,
remember this, remember that time where like COVID happened and you thought you had screwed yourself up and that was the end of that, but you
yeah,
instead, like a year later, I gave you this opportunity. And it's like the small remembers all the way through my life. And I was like, how can I not trust in the
right,
God who has like provided so consistently towards
right.
me throughout my life? And yet, the second a trouble comes up, I am quick to not remember any of those things.
For sure. Yeah.
So I'm
We
like,
have this like spiritual amnesia. Yeah.
100%. Like, I'm like, how do we not do that? I
Right.
don't know. Well, I know a lot
Yeah.
of it is grace, but that's great. But the Lord is always willing to provide grace for those who
Yeah.
ask of Him. So
Yeah.
what does that look like? I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's a huge point. One, I mean, like the idea of remembering, I love that you said like just the Lord like kind of like seared that word in your heart as you're reading it. But like, I mean, that was his command like throughout the entire Old Testament, right? Like
Yeah,
when
yeah,
when his people were wandering in the deserts, right? They would tell the stories of what God had done, right? And it wasn't just like it wasn't like reminiscing on the high school days. Do you know what I mean? It was telling these stories because it brings it back. Faith of that moment is sort of brought back to this moment. Do you know what I mean? And that sense of remembering, again, it's not a like a look back with like, oh, wasn't that swell? It's like there's something about bringing ourselves. I'm not going to go too deep on this because I don't know really what I'm talking about, but I love the idea of etymology, the
hmm
breakdown of words and the history
yeah,
or the root word and meaning of word, but like to remember. To be a member of something is to be one with, right? To remember is to be one with that again,
oh,
right? And so if you
sure,
think about like those moments, like where you're looking back and whether it's the Israelites or in your own life, like to remember that in a prayerful way is in some essence to become a member again with like the spiritual reality of that moment, right? And to grow in that or to bring that back to this moment. I think for me and even my wife, like just in our marriage and our life, like having times to like sit and talk about the things that God had done. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
in your life, in your family, in your marriage, in those places of need or providence, like actually verbalizing and remembering. I tend to journal a lot. It helps my
okay,
focus. And so like I'll go back through journals every now and then and just like and read it. Like, oh man, like I remember like going through this circumstance. I may not remember it here, but then I read it and like, oh yeah. And then I'll read later in the journal like how God like encountered that circumstance,
hmm
and it really brings like I think this practice of like the virtues, right? Faith, hope, and love, and even this way of hope, like being that they're virtues, right? They are gifts from God, but
right,
virtues are also like muscles. They are something
that's
you
right,
can grow in, right?
hmm
We're not helpless. This is all the
yeah,
faith I have, right? No,
that's
like
right.
Lord, here's my belief, help my unbelief,
Have
but
my unbelief,
also
right?
I'm going to live in a way that is actually producing faith in the sense of like I'm not going to orchestrate my life not needing God, right? The more I make room for the parachute, the more I'm growing in faith, right? In that sense. And so being that they are sort of muscles, you can practice them and you can work them out and help grow them.
That's right,
And so I think uh, those ideas of the remembering those moments are in some ways that we kind of reflex that like fatigued muscle, if that makes
that's right,
sense. Like, after you've been like bed rest or whatever, you're like, oh, I
yeah,
can barely walk, but like, how do you get that muscle moving again? And I think for like scripturally, you see like one of the ways like Jesus would just, or God would like call his people like to remember
remember,
my work here, remember what I did to your fathers, remember what I, you know, and even like testimony, you go into the more into like the New Testament, like the power of testimony that St. Paul would talk about, sharing with a group of people what God has done in my life, not only is increasing my faith, but like the people that are hearing this, their faith is being increased, whether
that's
they
right,
know it or not. Cause there's this subconscious of like, well, if that's what God did in that person's life, surely maybe he could do that for me, and it slowly, there's power in hearing and remembering what God has done as a way that positions us to be receptive to what he wants to maybe do,
absolutely.
going forward.
Yeah, I have a thought about this, but I'm going to hold off on it until if we
Yeah.
have time at the end, I'll come back to it. But I do
Okay.
want to quickly slightly deviate because we're not too far away from the recent events where there was a school shooting situation at
Yeah,
Annunciation Catholic High School, not high school, at the grade school
yeah.
during mass. And I think that was kind of the part that really, like, I think broke
Mm,
me a bit more. I'm always upset when I hear about it, but like there's a special, like, as a Catholic, like that's a really sacred moment. And I'm trying to think about those families, those students, and or even people like, as an educator, someone who works in schools, like
right.
there's a genuine fear, like there's like something that triggers.
Yeah,
He goes, oh crap, this is serious. um how do you hold fast hope in that
yeah,
situation, I guess?
yeah. I think, first of all, I would just say, like, I I'm speaking with great ignorance or great distance from that reality in
Absolutely.
the sense that, like, I cannot fathom, like, I was reading that, like, one of the unfortunately, the one of the children that was killed was 8 years old, and
Yeah.
that's my oldest, he's 8 right now, and I had just, like, that thought of, like, "Shit," like, "How could I," like, yeah, he wouldn't come home, do you know what I mean? Like, that's and so I don't wanna, like, even pretend that, like, I could fathom any of that, and so what I would maybe share is maybe just from, like, a theoretical angle,
Yeah,
and
absolutely,
not
absolutely.
because in that I couldn't, I couldn't, I don't know how I would
Yeah,
go through,
100%.
do you know what I mean? But theoretically, right, I think, like, and to kind of maybe go back to, like, the what we're talking about with the early church, is that, like, not to make light of death at all, stepping back, and there is this reality that, like, that is the singular constant that every one of us is gonna encounter,
That's right.
right? So, ultimately, that's the biggest question of hope, is that idea. Oh, my little son's here.
No, you're
"Hang
good.
out, Eli, hold on. Stay there, daddy's in a meeting." My 3-year-old is in his naked phase, so I'll keep that off the camera, I
Absolutely.
apologize.
You're good.
Um, but so there, right, that I think is the ultimate question of hope, right? Because we have these maybe more daily questions, right? Like, I hope I have financial means. I hope for, whatever, like relationship healing, or I hope for jobs, right? And that's all great. But, like, once we run through all those, the only one that's lasting is the hope of, like, this question of death,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And that's the only, I think, question that Christianity would boldly offer that no other religion or faith would even attempt to offer, right? Generally speaking, right? At least in some, clarity way, right? And that really, I think, comes down to, like, is God real? Is he who he says he is, right? Jesus came to reveal the heart of the Father, and through the cross, we see that he is willing to enter our mess, and through the resurrection, we see he is able to conquer our mess. And it's not on an earthly timeline, right? It's not it's not hope. Hope does apply to the earthly timeline, and we need hope, and we need to know that God will act in our temporal needs. But at whatever point we hit this final question of death, whether it's age, whether it's sickness, or God forbid, a tragedy,
Yeah.
the only thing that carries us beyond that is the hope that Jesus demonstrated he is willing to enter our sin and the effects of our sin, which is human death, right? Because death wasn't a part of God's plan, it's a result of the fall. So he's willing to enter our sin and all the effects of our sin and conquer that sin, conquer the effects of sin, conquer that grave in the resurrection. So ultimately, at the end of the day, like, even when my dad passed away a couple years ago, it's like I remember saying to my friend, like, this is the reason we're Catholic.
Yeah,
Because at the
that's
end
right.
of the day, this is the question. Do you know what I mean?
That's
Like,
right. Yeah.
this is it. And it's not that there aren't important things prior to this question in life, but, like, this is the ultimate, like, question that no one has a solution for other than Jesus. And
Mhm.
that, if we believe that, then we can live differently, then we can act on that. And I think where I've seen that aspect of hope so most profoundly demonstrated is in families who have gone through tragedies.
Absolutely.
And again, I can't fathom that, and I can't say that I would pray that I would have the faith to
Mhm.
hold fast in that, but I've seen families who have gone through horrible things, and somehow, in some mysterious way, like where scripture talks about how, like, you work all things to the good for those who love you, in
Mhm.
some mysterious way, these horrible moments of tragedy become almost this catch-22, right? And what hell meant to use to destroy ends up becoming this seed that
Yeah.
demonstrates to the world that there is something more powerful, and there's something that answers this question. And because that something is a someone named Jesus, I can actually go through this mess, and it still hurts, it's still
That's right.
painful, and I still hate it, and justice should still be served. But I can go through it knowing that it's a comma and not a period. Do you know what I
That's
mean?
right.
And
Yeah.
that's really the only, when it comes down to it, like I think all the despair that anyone would have in this life, whether it's an adult or a teen, whether it's just a despair of like depression, loneliness, or from a tragedy, right? Addiction, whatever it is, it's because ultimately our hearts are convinced that these moments are periods and not commas. And what,
Yeah.
not to sound poetic with that, but I mean, to go back to the garden, they believe that God was not good. And if God's not good, then my desire, like that's a period. There's nothing beyond this. It's me
That's
figuring it
right.
out, and that's it.
Yeah.
And there are things in life that we can't conquer, death being one
Hmm.
of them. And so that's the ultimate despair, is if we have to face this thing that we don't have a solution for, we don't have a 12-step program, we don't have a
Yeah.
counselor or an influencer who's gonna, like, no one has an answer for
Yeah.
death. And so it's a period for us. And that's the most despairing, hopeless reality of life's existence.
That's right.
Unless Jesus was incarnated, died on the cross, rose from the grave, and offers us that victory, then it's a comma. It means, okay, there's something else after this, and therefore I can go through it. I can get
Yeah.
through this, you know? And so
Yeah.
again, I feel like that's theoretical, and
Yeah.
I couldn't, and I know it's real. I know it's real. I know that's not theoretical in the sense of like some guy just made up a cool
Yeah.
framework to
Right.
think about.
Sure.
I know it's real, but to go through that, like that's like, I don't want to underestimate how painfully difficult that could be. But again, I think it's the only answer that Christianity offers the world, that nothing else in the world can attempt to offer, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, and it really is. I think it's yeah, it's I can't you're right, I can't imagine how brutal or how painful that suffering is, and it
Right.
really is just a really like it's really hard. But you're right, like that's what Christianity offers. It's like it's a true hope in that Christ is good, and
Right.
like even in the midst of suffering, he is still good, and he still
Right.
cares, and he still loves you. And that's very difficult to hear at times, but it's nevertheless
Yeah.
true, and that's our hope. That's and we can cling on to that in some real sense.
Right.
Um, yeah, yeah,
As a, this maybe is more lighthearted, or I guess maybe it's dumb too. I don't know. But like as a
yeah.
kid, again, like I loved certain bands growing up, and I remember being in high school. There was this band called the Supertones, and they were this Christian ska band, and they were from Orange County out here. And ska is. I realize you're probably a little bit young for it, but go check out a
Yeah.
ska video when you get a chance. It's
Okay,
nutty,
sure.
a lot of
Yeah.
horns, a lot of weird breakdowns. But
Yeah.
they had this song, and I don't remember the title of it, but the whole premise of the song is just I'm going to heaven, and it was and this idea was like I'm going to heaven, and so it matters, right? And then he would just list all these random situations that actually were changed because of the reality of I'm going to heaven. And it was like something like, when I'm filled with fear, it matters. It matters. When I'm in the dentist chair, it matters. It matters. And he's laying out life. And for me, I remember being in high school, so afraid of like, man, am I going to get a good grade on this test? As if that's the ultimate, like in that moment is probably the ultimate despairing, like, invitation, I guess. But just realizing like, oh wait, like if I believe in this invitation of heaven and I'm living this relationship with Jesus, like I get to go to heaven. And so play this out. If I get an F on this test, that sucks. But then what? Well,
Yeah.
maybe I
Right.
have to take a class again. Okay, that's the worst. Well, no, but let's say for some reason you fail out of high school. Okay, well then what? Well then maybe you can't get a job, and then you're homeless, and then you get to this point where you're like, oh, and then I would die. Oh, but I'm going to
And
heaven.
then go to heaven. That's
You
right.
know what I mean?
Yeah,
And you're like, okay,
that's
this
right.
test is important. I don't want to slacken off, and I don't want to be a someone who isn't co-laboring with what God has called me to do in that moment, the work
right.
of school or vocation, whatever it may be, right? But at the end of the day, it's to stop and be like, oh man, the fact that heaven exists and Jesus conquered everything that would keep me from it, and now the door's open for me, makes the biggest things on earth
That's
so
right.
small. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So small, right? Because even just in timeline, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm going to go through 3 bad weeks of an illness. And even if, God forbid, if it ended in death,
Yeah.
I have eternity in heaven ahead of me.
That's right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's almost
Yeah.
like hey, if I go to the gym and work out for 30 minutes, I'm going to a buffet afterwards, right? So I can get through 30 minutes on the treadmill because it's buffet. You know, and
That's
I think
right. Yeah.
like in that regard, like that's the reality of like, if we believe Jesus is who he says he is and he will do what he says he will do, then as Benedict would say, we can live with hope. And that means we can live differently regardless of the circumstance, because like it's none of these circumstances are periods. They're all
That's
commas
right.
and even death itself. And like there is something so real about heaven that that not only that it exists, but that it is the greatest fulfillment of everything
Mhm.
our hearts would desire. And that's
Yeah.
literally what's waiting for us. And that gives us power then to get through this moment today. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's not that it makes the suffering easier. It's just that it gives you something that you can aim towards.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will finish you off with one last question, and then I will let you go. I
Yeah.
promise.
No, you're good.
And it's very simply this. So the title of this podcast is Recasting Culture, and it was based upon I for the last 7 episodes I have said it's been Dorothy Day. Finally Googled it, was not Dorothy Day. It was Peter Morin who said, society where it's easier to be good, a society where it's easier to choose good. And the idea is that there are things in society that it's easier for us to choose brokenness at the moment at times than it is to choose something that is good and something that is holy. And so we're trying to change culture one section at a time. And I think, for me, I deal with a lot of high schoolers who have a lack of hope. And I'm sure you meet with a lot of people who it's not built into them anyway, naturally. And I guess my last question to you is, if you are encountering someone who is more on the side where they don't have that hope, they don't have that inclination towards Christ or trusting in him in the same way, and all they think is like, this whole world is pointless, I'm going to die, it's all going to be for nothing, why work, why do anything, why even strive for anything? What do you
Yeah.
say to a person like that?
Yeah. I think maybe there's 2 things I would offer, and I don't know if these are like the perfect answers. I think first of all, before maybe saying something, like hope is terrifying, right? Like again, this is why I think there's something almost deceptive about hope being reduced to this like Hobby Lobby sort of, like approach, this sentiment, is because it sort of like neuters it to some degree. But like hope in its like realist virtuous form is in incredibly like intimidating, and it can be incredibly scary because it is stepping out onto the thing that you don't get to control, right? Stepping out into that gap. It's jumping from the plane and hoping that the parachute opens, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's terrifying. So I think like to invite someone into hope is a very delicate thing, because sometimes it can just maybe be perceived as this idea of like recklessness, stupidity, right? Even to go back to Chesterton, I think his definition is spot on, right? Exactly. Like the minute hope ceases to be reasonable, it begins to be useful, right? We want a reasonable hope, and reasonable hope is something we can control, something
That's right.
that like is safe by whatever we've defined safety needs to be for us, right? Maybe
Yeah.
that's safety is not changing the way I live. Safety is not abandoning bad habits. Safety is keeping this friend group, whatever it is, right? Safety is my 5-year plan, right? And so real hope, I think, causes us to have to surrender that and say,
Yeah.
this life could jeopardize what I deem to be safe, right? And so I think all that to say, inviting someone to hope is tricky. I would say one of the best ways to invite someone to hope is to live a radical hope yourself, right? Like
Absolutely.
when you encounter someone, like your mom, for example, right? You may even have at times almost a sense of frustration, right? Of like, Mom, what are you doing?
That's
But
right.
you are still struck with somehow there is this ability in your mom to act beyond what seems reasonable, what seems safe. And there has to be this question like, man, like you're built differently. Do you know what I mean? Like there's this almost like attraction. And again, I think terrifying, right? When you get to the edge of a cliff or when you're in a wave, it's exciting and also terrifying, right? But so I think living it radically is probably one of the best ways, because it makes someone go like, you and I, we're going through similar circumstances,
Yeah.
but you're responding way differently, right? And I think that makes someone at least wonder. And I think the second thing, if I'm just talking with someone, is really like, it's crazy, like from evangelizing someone or, right, offering someone this need of faith or hope or love. At the end of the day, like all of our lives play out differently. but they're all sourced from the same similarities, right? At the end of the day, all human hearts have a desire to be fulfilled.
Mhm.
And that desire was given to us by God, and the only thing that will satisfy the desire is God. So that's not a lot of variables at the end, like underneath it all, right? And I
Yeah,
think,
right.
sorry, my dog's barking at my kid now.
No, you're good.
I think at the end of the day, they like just talking with someone, and if they don't feel like there is hope or there is more, like just really asking questions that help to sort of unearth like the condition of their heart, right? Because maybe it's they may think that they, God forbid, don't want to go on living.
Mhm.
But really, let's just say, ask that question, like, well, what do you think that's going to fix in your own life? And maybe that's going to bring up this experience. Well, like, ultimately, like, I'm alone, or ultimately, I have fear, or ultimately, whatever it is. And what you're getting to is back down to the same question in Eve's heart. There is a need, a desire, and you believe there's nothing big enough to satisfy the desire.
Right.
So your only result is you saving yourself.
Yeah.
And that's going to look like sin, period. And that
100%.
may be sin of lust, that may be sin of greed, or God forbid, sin of self-harm. But
Yeah.
all sin is trying to do is solve the desire for God apart from God. And I
Yeah.
think the more you can ask anyone the question underneath the question underneath the question, you get down to this thing of like, well, you long for, let's just say, you long to know that you're loved.
Yeah.
And you don't believe that there is a love that can actually love you given your condition, because you don't even love you, right? Because of the things you've done or the choices you made or what's been done to you. Well, the cross proves to me, like, that to God the Father, you're worth the life of God the Son, right? Like, so
Absolutely.
like let's talk about how loved you are now. You know, I don't know, like, I think for me, I would navigate, or at least try to, of just ultimately get it. Like, the human heart is a very messy thing, but at the end of the day, it's a very simple thing. It's this thing that was created with a hunger for God, and that will only be satisfied in God. And so if you have a hunger for God, but you're not turning to God for it, then chances are you're turning to these other things, and that's why you're so filled with despair. It says you
Absolutely.
don't believe that it'll ever be satisfied. They may never verbalize those words, but the experience they're going through is
Mhm.
exactly like that reality. This is why we become addicts,
That's
because
right.
we have Christopher West, another author I love.
Yeah.
Christopher West, he talks about, right, that we have an infinite hunger in our hearts, and all we can do as humans is put finite things into it, right? Another relationship, another
Yeah.
dollar,
That's right.
another accolade, another achievement, another moment of pleasure, right? Whatever it is. And we're turning to those things not because they're bad, but because we're actually desiring something good, and we've been lied to, convinced that those are the things to bring us that good, right? It's a perceived good. Nobody is tempted by things that they think are bad, right? No
That's
one's
right.
tempted by
Yeah.
broccoli. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
That's
right?
right.
And so he's saying, like, all we have, we have infinite hole, an infinite hunger, and all we have are to throw into our finite things. And he poses a question: how much finite does it take to add up to infinite? And the answer is it never will,
It never will. That's right.
right? And so we as addicts just throw idol after idol, not because we're bad, but because we're still freaking hungry,
Yeah.
right? And so we're throwing, well, maybe it's just another thing or a different thing, and maybe it's more of that other thing, and we just end up becoming so despaired because we're coming up to this point of this inconclusion of my hunger won't satisfy, and yet I'm throwing everything I have into it. And that really was Eve in the garden.
Yeah.
Desire for life, God won't fill it. I have to throw what I have into it.
Absolutely.
And that's where humanity starts crumbling. And so I think in a conversation with someone that doesn't feel they're like want to move in hope or take a chance on hope, I think ultimately just like trying to ask the questions to get down to like, what is it they're actually experiencing in the human experience of their heart? Because at that level, there's only a few things, and they all point to the reality that we don't believe that God is real or that he's as good as he says he is. So we're screwed. And so we're living in despair. We're scratching and clawing away at life. Whatever we think will satisfy the best we can. Popularity, more likes, more sex, self-harm, more whatever, because we think those are solutions to the hunger. And so I would just invite them and won't like, maybe, maybe you've tried all these things and you realize they're not right. You've tried more sex and,
Right.
you know, you're still not okay. Like you're still hungering. So what if we tried something else? Because I believe there's something big enough to fit that hole. And his name's Jesus. Let's talk
Yeah.
about it, you know?
Absolutely. Perfect.
So
Well,
I don't know if that makes sense or if that fully
no, it
answers, but
does.
that would be my thoughts.
No, absolutely. And you know, I would take away two things, especially from this interview, and those are the two questions: is God real, and is he who he says he is? I think that's definitely two questions to always keep in the back of your mind as you go through life. So again,
Yeah.
David, thank you so much for coming on.
No problem.
Please say hello to your kids and your dog for me, because you know I
For
appreciate the
sure.
fact joy is always good, and I always appreciate extra little distractions. It's always very fun,
For
like
sure.
the
Thank you.
bubbles and the hearts and stuff. It's very entertaining.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
I
right.
got to figure
Well,
that out.
no, you're good. Is there anywhere that you would like them to check you out? Anything that you write that you would like them to see? Whatever it is, I can put it down below. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, holdfasthope.com is sort of just a contact page for ministry stuff. And then, like I said, my day job, my friend and I, we run an agency called Seen and Unseen, and that website is We Are Seen and Unseen. And there's kind of a whole sacramental understanding of that. But that agency, we just kind of, our whole motto is we want to do good things for good reasons. And so we serve a lot of churches, a lot of dioceses and conferences, but also just like mom and pops, like a bakery or a barber shop. And we just want to do good things for good reasons. And so if it ends up being in a ministry context or just in a good family business, we like to come up with just creative solutions for design, marketing, that kind of thing. So if there's ever a need like that, you're welcome to hit me up. But also you can kind of see a lot of our, I think, just creative work there, which for me is really tied in and reflects a lot of just this human experience like we kind of been talking about, you know?
absolutely. Well, again, thank you, David, so much for coming
No
on.
problem.
And yeah, I'm excited to see you in a few weeks too.
Yeah, that sounds great. I appreciate it. Thanks for your
Okay,
time and for having me on.
absolutely appreciate it.
All right. God